Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I stumbled upon an ad in my local newspaper seeking imaginative individuals willing to earn good money. Since it was the only ad remotely suitable for me that week, I decided to give them a call, and we arranged an interview. They informed me that all I had to do was stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to monitor brain activity. During my time there, I was to visualize a double of myself. They called it my tulpa. It sounded simple enough, and I agreed to do it once they disclosed the compensation. The next day, I began. They led me to a basic room, provided a bed, and attached sensors to my head, connecting them to a small black box on the table beside me. They guided me through the process of visualizing my double once again, emphasizing that if I grew bored or restless, instead of moving around physically, I should visualize my double engaging in activities or try to interact with him. The goal was to keep him present throughout my time in the room. Initially, I struggled with the task. It was more controlled than any daydreaming I had done before. I would visualize my double for a few minutes, then become distracted. However, by the 4th day, I could sustain his presence for the entire 6 hours. They commended my progress, saying I was doing very well. In the 2nd week, they moved me to a different room equipped with wall-mounted speakers. They wanted to test if I could still maintain the tulpa's presence despite distracting stimuli. The music they played was discordant, unpleasant, and unsettling, making the process more challenging, but I managed nonetheless. The following week, the music became even more unsettling, featuring shrieks, feedback loops, sounds resembling an old-school modem dialing up, and guttural voices speaking a foreign language. Nonetheless, I remained composed. I was becoming quite adept at this by then. After about a month, boredom started to set in. To spice things up, I began interacting with my doppelganger. We engaged in conversations, played games like rock, paper, scissors, or I visualized him performing various activities like juggling or breakdancing. I questioned the researchers if my antics would negatively impact their study, but they encouraged me to continue. So we played and communicated, and it was entertaining for a while. However, things started to take a strange turn. One day, while recounting a story about my first date to my tulpa, he corrected me. I had mentioned that my date wore a yellow top, but he insisted it was green. After a moment of reflection, I realized he was right. It unsettled me initially, but the researchers explained that I was accessing my subconscious through the thought form. Apparently, I subconsciously knew I was mistaken and corrected myself through him. What initially seemed eerie soon became fascinating. I discovered I could tap into my subconscious through my tulpa. With some practice, I could question him and access a wealth of memories. He could recite entire pages from books I had read years ago, or recall details from lessons long forgotten in high school. It was truly remarkable. Around that time, I began summoning my double outside the research center. Initially sporadic, I grew so accustomed to visualizing him that it almost felt odd not to see him. So whenever I felt bored, I would conjure him up. Eventually, it became a habit, and I brought him along like an invisible companion everywhere I went. I imagined him during social gatherings with friends, visits to my mom, and once even on a date. Since I didn't need to speak aloud to him, I could converse with him without anyone else being the wiser. I realize it sounds peculiar, but it was enjoyable. Not only was he a repository of my knowledge and forgotten memories, but he also seemed to have a heightened understanding of me at times. He possessed an uncanny grasp of subtle body language cues that I wasn't consciously aware of. For instance, during a date where I initially thought things were going poorly, he pointed out subtle signs of interest from my date that I had missed. I listened, and that date turned out remarkably well. By the time I had been at the research center for 4 months, he was constantly by my side. One day, the researchers approached me after my shift, asking if I had ceased visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed satisfied. I silently questioned my tulpa about their inquiry, but he brushed it off, and so did I. I gradually distanced myself from the outside world. It became increasingly challenging to relate to people. While they seemed uncertain and confused about their actions, I had my tulpa as a constant companion, someone with whom I could confer. Socializing became awkward. Nobody else seemed to understand the motivations behind their behavior or what drove them. But I did, or at least I could ask myself and receive an answer. One evening, a friend confronted me, pounding at my door until I relented. He stormed in, visibly angry. "You haven't answered when I called you in weeks, you jerk," he yelled. "What's your problem?" I was about to apologize and suggest we go out for drinks to mend fences, but my tulpa intervened. "Hit him," it whispered, and before I could comprehend what was happening, I did. I heard his nose break as he stumbled back. Enraged, he retaliated, and soon we were engaged in a brutal altercation, trading blows back and forth until he fled, bloodied and bruised. In the aftermath, the police arrived, but I spun a tale, painting my friend as the aggressor. With him absent to dispute my account, they let me off with a warning. Throughout the ordeal, my tulpa grinned malevolently, reveling in my victory. It wasn't until the following morning, as I surveyed my injuries in the mirror, that I realized something unsettling. It wasn't me who had grown furious. It was my tulpa. I had been manipulated into a violent confrontation with a concerned friend, and I had fallen right into its trap. When I confronted the researchers about this revelation, they dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, refusing to entertain the possibility that my tulpa had autonomy or ill intentions. I attempted to heed their reassurances, but over the next few days, my anxiety around my tulpa escalated, and I noticed a change in its demeanor. It appeared taller and more menacing, with a mischievous glint in its eyes and a malevolent smirk permanently etched on its face. No job was worth jeopardizing my sanity, I reasoned. If my tulpa was spiraling out of control, I had to confront it. Despite being accustomed to visualizing it, I made a conscious effort to stop summoning it. It took days, but gradually I managed to banish it from my thoughts for extended periods. However, each time it resurfaced, it seemed more ominous. Its complexion grew pallid, its teeth sharper, and its behavior increasingly erratic. It hissed and gibbered, issuing threats and curses. The unsettling music that had accompanied my time at the research center now seemed to follow it everywhere, even infiltrating my home. Whenever I relaxed and let my guard down, there it was, accompanied by that haunting cacophony. Nevertheless, I continued visiting the research center and fulfilling my 6-hour shifts. I needed the income, and I believed the researchers were unaware of my deliberate efforts to suppress my tulpa. I was mistaken. One day, nearly 5.5 months into the experiment, 2 burly men seized and restrained me, while someone in a lab coat administered a hypodermic injection. I awoke in the same room, bound to the bed, with the dissonant music blaring and my monstrous doppelganger looming over me, cackling malevolently. Its appearance had deteriorated further, its features contorted into a grotesque visage. It towered over me, hunched and menacing, its hands resembling claws. It was utterly terrifying. I attempted to banish it with all my might, but my efforts were futile. It leaned in close, its fetid breath assaulting my senses, and taunted me sadistically. My struggles were in vain. I was completely at its mercy. For the ensuing weeks, I endured a hellish existence. Periodically, individuals in lab coats would administer injections or force-feed me pills, leaving me in a state of dizziness and confusion. I experienced hallucinations and delusions, all while my tulpa continued to torment me, either directly or indirectly exacerbating my suffering. I saw my worst fears materialize before my eyes, including the brutal murder of my mother, with my tulpa gleefully orchestrating the grotesque spectacle. It felt so real that I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. The doctors maintained a stony silence throughout my ordeal. Despite my desperate pleas and outbursts, they never acknowledged me. It felt as though they were communicating with my tulpa, my personal demon. At times, I questioned my sanity, wondering if these interactions were mere hallucinations induced by my tormentors. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that my tulpa held sway over them. One aspect of my nightmare stands out, one that I pray was a figment of my fractured mind, my tulpa's ability to inflict physical harm. It transcended mere psychological manipulation. It could touch me, hurt me. Its assaults ranged from cruel taunts and menacing gestures to outright violence. It would prod and poke at me whenever it felt ignored, and on occasion, it would inflict excruciating pain. I vividly recall one instance where it seized my testicles and squeezed until I professed my love for it. Another time, it slashed my forearm with its talon-like nails, leaving behind a permanent scar. I tried to rationalize these injuries, convincing myself that they were self-inflicted, but deep down, I knew the truth. Then, one fateful day, amidst its diabolical tirade about the annihilation of everyone I held dear, my tulpa paused. A curious expression crossed its grotesque features, and it reached out to touch my forehead, mirroring a gesture my mother used to comfort me when I was unwell. It remained motionless for a prolonged moment before grinning malevolently and uttering cryptic words. All thoughts are creative. With that ominous pronouncement, it departed, leaving me in a state of bewilderment and dread. Hours later, I succumbed to another injection-induced stupor. When I regained consciousness, I found myself unbound and alone in the room. Seizing the opportunity, I fled, stumbling through the desolate corridors until I emerged into the night air. Exhausted and traumatized, I collapsed in a secluded spot, consumed by overwhelming emotions. Eventually, I made my way home through a haze of fear and confusion. I barricaded myself indoors, hoping to find solace and safety within the familiar confines of my dwelling. Yet even as I sought refuge from the horrors of my past, they continued to haunt me relentlessly. Days turned into weeks, and while the physical scars began to heal, the emotional wounds remained raw and unyielding. I became a shell of my former self, plagued by incessant nightmares and debilitating panic attacks. The semblance of normalcy I desperately clung to crumbled with each passing day, leaving me adrift in a sea of despair. Then, 3 days ago, the phone rang, shattering the fragile tranquility of my seclusion. It was my mother, her voice trembling with grief as she delivered the devastating news. My sister had become the latest victim in a string of grisly murders. The perpetrator, they said, was a sadistic fiend who preyed upon his victims, leaving behind a trail of carnage in his wake. As I grappled with the magnitude of this revelation, A familiar cacophony echoed in the recesses of my mind, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. The discordant melody of my tormentor's presence, a chilling reminder of the horrors I thought I had escaped, now threatened to consume me once again.